Connecting, just give me 2 seconds. Okay, we are recording, great. The session is being recorded. It will be available with the other 2 sessions that were recorded from next week. We'll make sure that they're available from next week and before our next webinar. Okay, I think that is all from me in terms of the introductions. So I think we can kick it off. Felix, do you want to introduce our first speaker?
Sure. Again, welcome everyone. So as Adam said, that you're going to have to divide this third installment of our webinar series into 2. And the first session of it will be having Elena, and the second speaker will be István, right? So the overall topic of this webinar series will be that exploring global challenges of African diasporic communities. And as Adam mentioned, I'm particularly excited about this particular webinar because of the ways in which it will make us think of African diasporas outside the habituated, right? Because of the ways in which we have come to think of African diasporas in certain geographical and geopolitical areas. I think Elena's article would deal with that, African diasporas and migrants in Italy. And then the second paper for this session will deal with the African diasporas in Eastern and Central Europe, right? So Elena's Clarke and paper will be is titled Iterative Domestic Space, Shifting Focus to the Social and Spatial Homemaking Strategies of West African Diasporic Communities Living in Rome. She is a candidate for the Master in Design Studies in.
Okay, don't worry. I think he's frozen.
Okay. Harvard University is graduate, so in the bio itself. If you want to read a bio, then I'll drop the bio at the chat session so that you can see it there. So without much further ado, I welcome Elena to take over the presentation.
Okay, let me unmute you, Elena. Hold on. Okay, I think you're muted. Okay, you're unmuted. There we go. Yeah,
my volume's okay?
Your volumes are perfect. We can hear you. You were just unmuted. You were just muted at the beginning.
Okay.
We can hear you though. Okay, great. We can hear you perfectly now.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Let's see. So in this paper, I apply critical race theory, CRT, in order to analyze the limitations placed on the social and physical mobilities of members of West African diasporic communities living in Rome as they engage in processes of homemaking. The framework of CRT provides a ready set of tools to systematically analyze the persistence of racism, its psychological and physiological impacts, and its pervasiveness in contemporary institutions and widespread social behaviors, including explicitly racist remarks, implicit bias, and microaggressions. The perspective provided by CRT contradicts the colorblind narratives that champion the equality of European social policies and obscure the identification of racism. I will suggest that the tools of critical race theory can furthermore be used to develop a more critical understanding of how local solidarity efforts impose often biased requirements and rely on Eurocentric narratives that limit full participation to Europeanized actors. I will propose that lessons from CRT be applied in order to concentrate focus on migrants' own homemaking strategies and to position these over paternalistic interventions that tend to focus on only providing shelter. In particular, I focus on the strategies of young Black Muslim men from Senegal, the Gambia, and Mali to confront the limitations placed on their social and physical mobilities while they are living in Rome. I focus on these groups in part because their population sizes in Rome are among the largest local sub-Saharan groups frequently assigned an irregular status, the result of an outright rejection of their asylum application or of an extended period of bureaucratic limbo where they are kept waiting without a final answer. The complications produced by what the EU calls an irregular status include the frequent denial of work permits for irregular migrants, producing episodes of labor exploitation in lengthy periods where they are unable to work, leave Italy, or sign a lease agreement. These complications continue even after acquiring regularized status through widespread discriminatory practices that deny Black migrants legal work contracts and access to well-paying jobs and stable housing. The combined effects of these and other factors place groups of young men from Senegal, the Gambia, and Mali at high risk of experiencing extended periods of homelessness. Many of the strategies that these groups of young men engage in through shared practices of homemaking aim to produce spaces where they can socialize, cook, practice religion, or remain without disturbance while being able to move in and out of the space in question freely. These strategies therefore extend far beyond the search for shelter, but remain intertwined with simultaneous and overlapping efforts to secure work and housing, as well as with efforts to acquire a regularized legal status and to register a local address. Homemaking strategies are frequently and repeatedly disrupted by behaviors deeply rooted in racism. These include, but are of course not limited to, experiences where a young Black man feels forced to leave an area because he has been disturbed by a police officer, as well as experiences where he is displaced by a racist encounter with a civilian. Meanwhile, programs implemented in shelters that are part of the reception system regularly engage in what they call the re-education of residents, which promotes cultural narratives about migrants needing to be socialized to Italian norms while siloing them into low-paid employment where their skills, previous experiences, and intellectual competencies are rendered irrelevant. While singular acts of racism are regularly condemned on popular media, there have been limited efforts to systematically confront the racism present in these and other behaviors. When confronted with deeply embedded and widespread patterns of discriminatory behaviors, local people largely prefer to provide race-neutral justifications in order to rationalize or legitimize these behaviors. Efforts to systematically identify the presence of racism and to acknowledge its cumulative effects on the lives of those subjected to it are further obscured by the generalized conflation of racism and xenophobia. Since the Italian census does not record race or ethnicity and police stops are not meant to either, national origin becomes an all-encompassing identity category. This complicates thorough studies of employment discrimination and police profiling in Italy. On paper, the EU guarantees social, economic, civil, and political rights without discrimination. Legislation explicitly forbids profiling during police checks where a subject's race, ethnicity, or national origin becomes the reason for the stop or search of a person. As a member state, Italian legislation contains similar anti-discrimination components, including requiring police officers, if asked at the time of the search, to record on paper a legitimate reason for the search, which obviously exclude those tied to race or presumed national origin. In practice, this provides few protections to those being stopped who cite experiences where police officers have lied in the issuing of fines or citations in Rome. Moreover, anti-discrimination laws in Italy and in Europe at large are further complicated by contradictory security policies passed in the past 5 years that permit members of law enforcement within the EU to ask any person in a public area to produce a valid form of identification, which in Italy, if you are unable to produce identification, you risk 1 year of prison and a €2,000 fine. So news sources and first-person accounts have repeatedly commented on how this systematically produces racial and ethnic profiling that is contradictory to any anti-discrimination legislation. Yet the idea that discrimination has been and continues to be adequately dealt with through legislation continues to be predominantly accepted. This view conveniently permits the existing trend of condemning singular acts of racism without requiring people to systematically reevaluate and critique what CRT scholars would call their own possessive investment in whiteness. Recent conceptual trends in the migration and border studies of Europe have incorporated foundational concepts of CRT through analyses of the varied racialized experiences of migrants in Europe, particularly as they are impacted through the biopolitics of European borders. Scholarship about contemporary migration to the EU has explicitly referenced concepts of CRT, and it is also indirectly overlapped with CRT, in part due to the overlaps of both with post-colonial critique that excavates lasting colonial legacies and affect underlying global power dynamics. So now I'll turn my attention to a discussion of the overlaps between CRT and the recent conceptual trends in the migration and border studies of Europe. Sub-Saharan migration to the EU has become highly publicized as a crisis since 2011 through reports of dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean Sea and records of the extreme exclusion migrants face in Europe. In Italy, this has taken the form of shocking death tolls recorded in Lampedusa, as well as accounts of extended periods of homelessness and exploitative work arrangements that many experience after arrival. The rhetoric of crisis suggests that these events are a deviation from what is expected. However, recent critical migration scholarship has turned attention to the ways that increasingly strict border controls and asylum regulations directly produce dangerous conditions for migrants. These conditions are therefore not considered the result of design flaws, but rather the direct and sometimes intended result of policy, in particular policy meant to produce difficult conditions that might serve as deterrents for incoming migrants. Critical migration scholars have tracked how the tightening of border controls has coincided with a shift in the countries of origin of asylum seekers. Post-World War II, most asylum seekers came from other European countries. Today's migration is from Europe's former colonies. Migration scholars have borrowed from CRT to propose that the contemporary quote-unquote migration crisis be redubbed the European racial crisis. Like the framework of CRT that exposes the racially biased systems intended to protect white privilege in America, this trend in migration scholarship directs attention to the racial bias inherent in the border systems that protect historically accumulated wealth in Europe. Along the same lines, critical migration scholars have looked within EU countries to the differential application of administrative rules and the disparate treatment of migrant social groups as evidence of racism. Borrowing again from CRT, recent migration scholarship has explored intersectional understandings of migrants' experiences, examining their differential access to resources because of interlocking systems that discriminate on the basis of race, class, nationality, gender, orientation, and age. They argue that these multiple and interlocking forms of discrimination are deeply entrenched in European societies, and that this in part explains why legal entitlements do not result in concrete outcomes for most migrants. In Italy, increasingly complex asylum regulations and discriminatory practices render it practically impossible for migrants to secure stable housing, which is a formal prerequisite to access many social and civil rights within the country. The registration of a physical address is a prerequisite for enrollment in Italian social assistance, healthcare, education, and public housing. In most cases, it is a prerequisite to sign up for water, electricity, gas, cell phone service, or Wi-Fi, and it is a prerequisite to open a bank account or register a work contract. Those experiencing homelessness in Rome have a legal right to register through the pseudo address via Modesta Valenti. However, whether or not this pseudo address is accepted by authorities varies greatly between municipal districts. Studies have shown that migrants are systematically prevented from acquiring and/or registering a physical address in Italy through discriminatory practices. These include the enforcement of additional administrative standards that supposedly determine whether the applicant is socially dangerous and whether the residence is suitable for domestic use. These also involve arbitrary demands for documentation proving that the applicant has a local job, an adequate income, and no criminal record. In addition to these administrative practices, private landlords in Rome often refuse to rent apartments to migrants, claiming that they only rent to students or to professionals with full-time employment, and sometimes explicitly saying that they don't rent at all to Black Africans. Other practices that prevent migrants from settling in local neighborhoods include microaggressions like constant surveillance and poor treatment from neighbors. Pronounced civic stratification is therefore produced in Italy through the intersectional systems of exclusion that prevent migrants, and particularly members of the West African diaspora, from legally acquiring and/or registering a physical address. This keeps many in a state of limbo for years, preventing them from settling while simultaneously ensuring that the country's needs for underpaid and exploited workers are met. Many members of the West African diaspora in Rome turn to unsanctioned forms of housing, such as outdoor camps, squatted buildings, and the sublease of apartments without signing rental agreements. These and similar strategies are aimed at satisfying an immediate need for housing that simultaneously escapes legal controls and infantilizing institutional environments. These strategies can sometimes lead to exploitative arrangements, and they provide occupants with no guarantee that they won't be suddenly evicted. However, these strategies can also present opportunities for homemaking and for migrants to enact spaces of cultural survival. Eviction has become commonplace in migrants' lives, enacted through their forced removal from the physical spaces of reception centers and unsanctioned housing, or through the social and material exclusion they experience due to discriminatory practices. Migrants negotiate these daily experiences by engaging in a variety of strategies. Their efforts are generally supported by solidarity actors, which in Rome include civil society, local politicians, grassroots social and political movements, church organizations, and other informal networks. These solidarity actors work to mitigate the harmful effects of spatial and social exclusion. Unfortunately, a large majority of solidarity efforts fall into traps that reduce the social groups experiencing exclusion to flat abstractions, resulting at best in their token participation. The implied passivity of those receiving support often reifies unequal power relations and constructs solidarity actors as the expert saviors. Furthermore, conventional solidarity strategies prioritize discussion and protest around rights, often fail to engage migrants who prefer to pursue direct action.
Please, you should be winding up, please.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Who would prefer direct action and concrete outcomes. So I'll discuss a few examples to illustrate this, the first of which describes the membership tactics of a local grassroots movement in Rome that requires all members of the group to attend designated internal meetings, public press conferences, and protests. The group provides its members certain legal and social assistance, but membership is contingent on continued participation in these meetings. The protests are often loud and heavily policed by officers in riot gear, a less than ideal situation for many who do not possess a regularized legal status at the time of the protest. The form of communication widely deployed during these protests is generally long-form speeches in Italian, which might also arguably limit the full engagement of many attendees and render the protest at least partially inaccessible for some. The second example I'll briefly discuss is two commonly deployed tactics to raise awareness of the social and material exclusion of migrants within the local community. The first tactic involves solidarity actors dispatching journalists and camera crews to outdoor areas where groups sleep, often neglecting to provide the groups sleeping in those outdoor areas with advance warning that camera crews will be arriving. This often culminates in angry confrontations with the journalist. The claim in this case is that allowing journalists to photograph and publish reports on the camp will result in politicians being prompted to produce more immediate solutions to provide shelter for the people sleeping outdoors. However, many of the young men that I've spoken with report feeling exploited in these situations and very rarely report receiving any tangible benefits. And then the last tactic that I will discuss is the efforts of solidarity actors in escorting groups of asylum seekers to local high schools, where they are asked to speak to students about their experiences previous to their arrival in Italy and how their lives have evolved since. These are highly controlled situations, with the main purpose being to sensitize students to the experiences of migrants and asylum seekers living in Italy. They are, again, however, scenarios that rarely result in any changes to the material realities of migrants' lives. Turning back briefly to contemporary migration scholarship, I'd like to suggest a parallel between the certain trends in migration studies and the experiences that I've described above, which suggests a continued positioning of the white European subject as the norm by focusing solidarity efforts on sensitizing European subjects to the experiences of other people. This positioning continues to focus efforts on changing the experiences of Europeans while demanding that others participate in the process or otherwise conform to previously existing forms of political action. Much, not all, of the critical scholarship on contemporary migration and border studies of Europe is largely grounded in and relies heavily on continental philosophy, requiring a substantial amount of knowledge on theories developed in Western Europe. This scholarship is widely produced in formats that conform to conventional academic writing standards, with its primary audiences being academics, governments, and civil society organizations. It's often produced in the format of academic papers or book-length ethnographies intended to communicate to audiences the multivariate subject experiences of migrants and asylum seekers in contemporary Europe. I believe that the focus of this and similar scholarship on communicating the personhood and agency of the subjects of its study is revealing of its focus on sensitizing outside audiences to the experiences of migrants and asylum seekers. This focus, which I find overlaps with many solidarity efforts, might have evolved with the intended goal of supporting the efforts of migrants. However, I would like to ask whether these efforts might also arguably reproduce hierarchical orderings between the knower and the known by limiting full participation in these processes and failing to continually engage with migrants as the authors of their own stories and as active members of the audience and/or the political community. And last slide, CRT provides a framework that could shift focus to the meanings migrants give their own experiences and could advocate for their placement in roles that would enable them to chart potential paths forward. Through its intersectional and counter storytelling approaches, CRT provides avenues for the inclusion of variety that rejects the flattening of differences and enables understandings of how we can organize in ways that respect and continually engage with the complex differences between people's experiences. CRT scholars, as well as scholars of post-colonial critique, often employ experimental forms of narrative directly intended to enlist the participation of a variety of groups. Furthermore, with its origins in civil rights scholarship, Black radicalism, and a strong grounding in post-colonial knowledge, work that engages with CRT not only includes African diasporas in its intended audience, but also considers them to be among its authors. My intention by suggesting that solidarity efforts be rerouted through the framework of CRT is not to write off migration scholarship or existing local forms of solidarity. My intention is rather to expand the tools available to help us move beyond conversations about migrants as populations to be managed, saved, romanticized, understood, or ignored, all conversations which, in my opinion, preclude them from active participation. Thanks.
Thank you, Elena, for that illuminating presentation that you've given us. So just as a reminder, if you have any questions, can you please type them in the question and A session, and then Adam will I'll give some time after this session for the presenters to respond to the question. So the next presenter is Professor István Tarrósy. I hope I'm saying that right. And István Tarrósy is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and International Studies, University of Pécs, and part-time professor at Corvinus University of Budapest. His paper today, he will be presenting on extending global African diaspora research, the case of the neglected African communities of post-communist Central Europe. So, Professor István, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I wholeheartedly welcome everybody and thank you for putting me on the panel. Very interesting afternoon. I wish to address this issue, and as you can see in the title, I call these African diaspora community as the neglected ones. That will be argued for from various angles. And as we acknowledge, of course, African immigrants are part of the global transnational communities. And of course, they are obviously present also across post-Soviet spaces, therefore in post-communist Central and Eastern Europe and Eastern European countries too. So I think we should look at, these regions as well when we foster global African diaspora research. Of course, we use a number of overarching, categories in terms of post-Soviet, post-Eastern Bloc, post-communist, all referring to what has been going on since the end of the bipolar world, from political, economic, as well as social angles. And my intention is to focus and narrow it down a bit and focus on Central and Eastern Europe, especially the so-called Visegrad 4. The Visegrad 4 countries include Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, my country as well. And it's a very interesting sub-regional formation of collaboration within the European Union, especially since 2004, when there was a huge boom of European integration, having included 10 new countries then into the European Union. And I propose in my research that the not so known and the not so well described African communities living in these particular countries are integrated into the study of global African diaspora. Whenever you open up, global African diaspora books, volumes, research papers, you would really hardly see references to these regions and African communities living in these regions. So I cannot agree more with my Russian colleagues, Dmitry Bondarenko, and colleagues in the Moscow Academy of Sciences Institute, in pointing out that without taking migrations serious, migrations to the post-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe into serious account, any research on global African migration processes and their consequences at the European or wider level would be a priori incomplete and imperfect. So actually, I wish to raise awareness about these African communities in my research and connect that to a kind of a rise of re-engagements of these countries with Africa, the African continent, also at the same time, and raise awareness basically about the Central and Eastern European experience, which so far, as I consider it, has been scarcely dealt with in any academic debate. Africa policies, Africa strategies, these are the words you can hear these years actually all across these Central and Eastern European countries as well. Of course, we are over the bipolar kind of setting. We are far beyond, when times were determined by a kind of an ideological cloud driven by, a Moscow center. And what you can see is that, of course, after the regime change is happening at the end of the 1980s, all across the Eastern Bloc, the former Eastern Bloc, basically for many years, Africa somehow disappeared from the foreign policy mindset and maps of these countries. Even when you look at the then new Russian foreign policy, that also dealt with African engagements in quite a marginal way, not so important and so on. And that was the case in my country, in Hungary, and all across Central and Eastern Europe. What then happened after this EU accession in 2000 and EU enlargement in 2004, and especially since the 2010s, so the last decade, basically, Africa has become again put high on the, or higher on the political agenda, higher on the foreign policy agendas of the post-Soviet and post-communist countries. You can see in the foreign policy documents you know, the so-called global openings, the opening towards the east, the opening towards the south, referring to how, you know, collaboration with and engagement with African countries can be rethought and in a pragmatic foreign policy approach put forward. So Russia has been doing it finally again. If you just check the very last Russia, you know, Africa summit in Sochi, you know, last year, as well as you can see what in the last 10 years or so, Russia also has been, you know, encouraging in the form of the Business Forum Russia Africa, focusing on trade, especially intensifying it, as well as also looking at a wider context of the BRICS, as we know. And it's interesting to look at, for instance, you know, how trade has been, you know, changing. And Russia now looks at other emerging economies such as Turkey and what Turkey has been, you know, putting forward in terms of collaborating with African countries and also, you know, competing at the same time. There are a couple of tools Russia also has been developing, you know, helping Russian companies as well as other entities to get engaged with, you know, other African markets out there. But let's just focus now on the Visegrad 4. First, the Czech Republic. Let me show you in a similar manner the presence of these countries all across Africa. The Czech Republic has the largest number of diplomatic representation in terms of formal, you know, diplomatic missions, 12 embassies, out of which 8 can be found in sub-Saharan African countries, as you can see. And in 2015, this concept, a new foreign policy concept was accepted by the government. And since 2017, also a kind of a strategy of the Czech Republic focusing on how to get engaged with sub-Saharan African countries was also put into place. The focus here is on economic diplomacy, international development assistance, as well as academic and cultural ties. Public diplomacy plays a role in that, and also coming along with that, high-level visits. In Slovakia, much less in terms of diplomatic representation, but without any separate Africa strategy or Africa policy, you can see that, for instance, a government agency called Slovak Aid has been very active in international development assistance. A number of projects in Kenya, for instance, one of them actually was in the last couple of years a triangular project between Slovakia, Hungary, and Kenya, and my university also participated in that in the city of Eldoret, in the slum area of Langas within the city itself, managing a clinic. For instance, we sent for a couple of years young doctors to work at that clinic together with the Slovakian nurses in that particular part of the city. Poland is very active with its 11 embassies at the moment, although it doesn't have, you know, a separate Africa strategy, but it has been active in terms of the Go Africa project, as well as the summitry it has been, you know, organizing in the form of the Poland Africa Congress high-level meetings. So again, here you can see a tangible, pragmatic foreign policy framework that fosters the re-engagements of the country with Africa, focusing on economic diplomacy, trade again, technology transfer, especially, for instance, lately in the alternative energy solution sector. And Hungary, finally, with the same amount of embassies, which of course plays a role. I mean, you know, without, you know, proper official diplomatic representation, it is very difficult to foster any such engagement. And Hungary in 2019 announced a separate government Africa strategy, which focuses on a number of important segments, including, for instance, scholarships offered to young African people to come to study at Hungarian universities for a degree, BA, MA, PhD, all levels are included. And this is financed by the taxpayers' money, actually, run by the government. So it's again a revitalization of something happening in the immediate past before the political changes of the 1980s. It's a kind of a revitalization of a foreign policy tool. So cultural and technological cooperation is very much put forward by the government. What you can see here is that, the portfolios are quite similar. Yeah, the 4 Visegrad countries offer more or less the same. They are present more or less, in the same African countries. So the question is whether they can come together more and propose a Visegrad 4 brand at the same time, not just individual country approaches, but also a regional Visegrad approach towards, African engagements. A very interesting aspect to the formal diplomatic representation, which I looked at, and probably this is the first time when we were also dealing with the additional foreign policy tools in the form of the honorary consular network. And you can see where these 4 countries operate honorary consulates as well as other consular services. They also add to intensifying collaboration all around. So quite a heavy element to that. And that results, of course, in an intensified trade volume between African countries, as well as these 4, as you can see here. Also, more and more so, especially coming along with the European Union membership, more and more peace missions are put forward. And one of my colleagues actually recently published a paper focusing on the Visegrad presence in these African peace missions. So all across the continent, you will find Central and Eastern European, added value basically to peace missions. Well, you need to go back at the same time to understand, all these re-engagements. You need to go back to the immediate past, the communist past, actually, of all these countries, where, Hungarian, Czechoslovakian then, and other brands were very much present in a tangible sense in the African market. So, you can also ask whether or not such nostalgia connected to, for instance, the best Hungarian buses that time by Icarus, or, the rail car engines, whatever, medical equipment producers and so on. Can that help, get back to Africa in the sense that, these strategies propose? We also investigate this question in our research. And the major point here, focusing on the African diaspora communities, can successful Africans living all across these Central and Eastern European countries add to the aspirations of the governments, get back to Africa and intensify collaboration? And what you can see here is that, yes, within the small but, growing, diaspora communities in these countries, you will find a number of players, a number of actors, individual as well as in organizational sense, civil society, NGOs, who would add to these aspirations, because they do their job, in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of intensifying all sorts of collaborations in culture, as well as technology transfer and so on. So, I mean, when you look into these strategies, you have to figure out whether within the strategies, within these policies, Africans are mentioned, African diaspora linkages are mentioned, and to what extent. Also, from a political perspective, it's also interesting to deal with whether or not from the African diaspora communities, the local society can choose, would choose, should choose politicians into the national parliaments. Here you can see some examples, especially from Poland, 2 gentlemen of African origin from the African diaspora community working in the lower house of the Polish parliament, another guy in the Hungarian parliament with a parent from Guinea-Bissau, and yet another person from the city of Piran in Slovenia, being one of the best ever mayors of the city so far. So all these would matter for diaspora research. And what actually I would like to add to that is that, of course, all these African policies, Africa strategies should look at these diaspora communities as true bridges which can, of course, contribute to building further bilateral as well as multilateral terms and collaborations between their origin countries as well as their chosen new countries. And of course, I mean, triple win scenarios can also be imagined between these two countries as well as the migrants themselves, if these are considered properly. From a Visegrad perspective, the ultimately small African communities, and that means ranging between several thousands, can also function as active contributors to these new Africa policies or strategies, if you wish. Of course, you can have a look at the history of how these communities developed, but I have limited time, so it's just a flash up, and in the paper, of course, you can read more of that. But since basically the 1960s, you can see a growing number, however, a small number still all across. This is just the case of Hungary, where you can see that the population decreases, and actually that's not a new phenomenon, that's not a Hungarian unique phenomenon. All across Europe, you can see aging societies. Within this aging society, there is a growing number of Africans, and the number is around 7,000 according to the statistical office, out of a country, as you can see, going back of less than 10 million. The same would apply in the other three Visegrad 4 countries. So a small but important diaspora community is tangible in these countries. These Africans are successful in their profession, are successful in their achievements, and they can motivate further other collaborations. Yeah, I'm just finishing off. And very much embedded in Hungarian society, as well as keeping contact, not just because of remittances, but keeping contact in that transnational Pan-African sense with their home countries and home communities as well. So they can really function as true bridges, basically, all across. So just some concluding thoughts. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the end of the bipolar world, where you look at the European map and you will see a community, a European Union, basically at the moment of 27 countries, within which you will find these post-communist countries as well, with their unique history, with their specific features. You can see how they foster very much exactly the same pragmatic foreign policies of re-engagements towards sub-Saharan Africa, the African continent as such. And in that process, which I put forward, is that these African diaspora communities living in the countries can play a role. Therefore, all these policies should include a chapter focusing on these communities, how to include them in a proactive and active way. Thank you so much for attention.
Thank you both. I mean, for such enlightening and illuminating and just fascinating papers. Just before we go to the questions, I see Shobana's got a question as well, which Felix has just sent to me. So Shobana, I've seen it, got it. Let me ask you, do either of you, considering even if they're a little tangential, the connections that we can see between the papers, do either of you have any questions for one another that you can think of?
Yeah, well, I do, yes.
Okay, great.
I very much.
Let's start there.
Thank you. I very much liked Elena's work from this very critical perspective. One of my former PhD students actually spent a lot of time in Rome focusing on the Centro Sociale. And of course, you touched also upon, to some extent that in your talk as a form of engagement. And when you look at the sensitizing issue, I'm very much interested in, how you can imagine that under a big pressure coming from the political forces all across, not just in Italy, in Central and Eastern Europe, even more so. So how can you imagine the success of any sensitizing policy or approach when you have very anti-immigrant rhetoric and basically an environment you also mentioned, which would not foster this basically, but just goes against that. I think it's a very, very, very harsh environment at the moment, and sensitizing is very difficult, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I think that ties into part of what Felix asked me too. But I actually don't think that the sensitizing efforts are successful. And I think that instead of, I guess the point I was trying to make is that instead of focus on sensitizing Europeans to other people's experiences, they should focus on trying to gain concrete benefits for the people that they claim that they're helping. So I guess my critique from that was that they believe that they are well-meaning, but then in the end, they're kind of just perpetuating the same cycle. So yeah, and my hope from rerouting through CRT would be that the ones who consider themselves to be solidarity actors, they would stop leading those conversations in very particular ways, which seem to be very devoted to the European subject or structured around that, and instead kind of step back and work more on just facilitating the strategies that migrants are already engaging in, and just focusing on enabling those.
Thank you.
Right. Any questions from your side, Elena?
No.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
No, I just thought I'd give you both a chance first. No, it's cool.
Yeah.
Give it a chance to think about it. It's not a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on just a second. Let's go to, no, yeah. Okay, no, it's cool. Okay. Let's go to these questions. Because there's quite detailed ones. So I'll start with you, Elena, yours, and then we'll go into István's, and we've got 10 minutes. Okay, so are Somali immigrants treated differently in Italy than the rest of Africa? I'm hinting here at the role of colonial legacies. Probably some Africans are treated better, e.g. Francophones in France than others. And she says, an excellent paper and thanks.
Thank you. From what I've seen, they aren't treated differently. What I was trying to show when I showed the slide about their population size and in Rome and the asylum acceptance rates is that it's a lot easier to secure a job and find an apartment once you have that approved asylum document. But in general, like they go through very negative experiences as well. I would say North Africans are treated in general better, but not necessarily Somali.
Okay, fantastic. Then I'm going to go to one for you, István. While Hungary is trying to create a pragmatic foreign policy approach, as the PECS prof puts it, as you put it, but Hungary's domestic policies on immigration, considering its right-wing ideology, will never make immigration a smooth process for immigrants. The government's scholarship, Stipendium Hungarian Scholarship, is not even citizens. And he says, when as a black person, can I tell that discriminating is senseless because I was brought to Hungary by its government? They don't believe me. They just say it's impossible. Orban can never bring, black people in Hungary. Shall I try? Did you get that?
Yeah. I guess I thank you. I guess I did. So, well, you can see two parallel processes. One is which should not be a surprise. You know, when you say, Hungary is trying to create a pragmatic foreign policy approach. Well, everybody does that, you know, all countries basically faster, especially when you look at African engagements. Yeah. So, you know, Hungary, Poland, others would come up with such pragmatic approaches. There are two parallel processes. One is this, and as a result of such a pragmatic approach, you can see tools being developed. One of the tools is this scholarship program. The scholarship program is nothing new because in the socialist times, for decades actually, the then government of Hungary operated such a state scholarship program, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Africans came then to Hungary to earn a degree. So then they went back home or stayed in the region, and they also contribute to the diaspora communities. Then the other process is since basically 2015, coming along with the refugee crisis in Europe, the European landscape, especially the Mediterranean. So then a very anti-immigrant rhetoric, as well as from a national policy perspective, a very anti-immigrant immigration policy of the government, and the society at large subscribe for that without, and truly right, Dzaleka also pointing that out, actually, without knowing about the pragmatism, which is at the same time on the table. So Hungarian society would not know about the scholarship program it pays for. It's very interesting. And two cards are played actually at the same time. So in that sense, you can also, of course, point out some contradictory approaches. So actually it is there. However, African students come to Hungary just focusing on this scholarship program. It's a great scholarship program, and we have a rising number of African young people coming to study at a Hungarian university.
Thank you. Just in terms of our time, we're looking at 4 minutes. So I'm going to give each of you one question. Let me just scroll down and find one for Elena. Okay. I do also want to get to Felix's as well, but let's see. So let me go to Jamie's question for Elena. So Elena, when I was visiting Sardinia recently, I observed Chinese shopkeepers and African street vendors who did business with one another. Do you see research on diaspora in Europe, including relationships between Asian and African migrants, rather than seeing different diasporas in isolation from one another? Good question.
Thank you. There is definitely research that links multiple diasporas together. In the case of Rome, though, I think that there are many Chinese shopkeepers or Arabic shopkeepers, but the different diaspora kind of set up a different particular business hierarchy. And then they tend to hire between the diaspora. And so, I mean, this is very particular to Rome. So I think in different cities, it'll be a very different type of dynamic between the multiple diasporas. But in Rome in general, this is it. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to Shobana's question now for István, just so we know our panelists also. She says she wants to know about the shoe brand about Bata, okay, sorry, Bata, which did not appear in your slides on brands. How did this brand become a global product around the developing world? What is its origin in Zin?
I couldn't hear the first part. Sorry.
Okay, sure. I'll repeat it. I was also trying to read it. So. She wants to ask about the shoe brand, Bata.
Yeah, Bata,
okay?
yeah.
Bata, yeah. That's it, yeah. That was my pronunciation as well.
No
which did not appear in your slides on brands, okay? So it didn't appear on your slides in brands. So what she wants to know is, how did this brand become a global product around the developing world? And what is its origin in Lynn?
Well, of course, I mean, it's not a Hungarian brand, but it's from this part of the world. And as far as I'm concerned now, it is owned by not from a company not from East Central Europe any longer. So it was a great brand in terms of being available and durable enough, as well as, from a design perspective, it used to be an appealing, brand, an appealing, a colorful, actually, part of the outfit, and I think that these are the features that are the most important in terms of building up such a commitment as well as belief in such brands. Yeah, when I think of, for instance, other Hungarian brands, for instance, not just the buses, but let's say the washing machines under the brand Hajdu. Yeah, available, cheap enough, that means, yeah, but available, durable enough, serving, the local communities proper. Therefore, people having a faith, having a belief in, products coming from those countries that they can buy, and therefore somehow connecting via the products and the brands such as Bata and others, to the countries where they are from. Therefore, in the policy making sense. And that's the reason why I refer to the kind of a nostalgia, and also Jamie Monson, asked me about that. I can see, yeah, there is a kind of an attachment, or can be an attachment to these products in the mindset, especially of the older generations. The problem is, in the case of Hungary and in many other countries, that these products are not any longer in the hands of Hungarian companies. Or they just faded away. So, I don't think that we can really build upon those in the new phase of the re-engagements.
I'm glad that you addressed that Jamie's nostalgia question, because I looked at it and I thought it was a very good one. I'm glad that you actually addressed it.
Thank you. Yeah,
it's a very good one. I wonder if you want to address that one in a little bit more detail when we come to you. But what I want to do is just take one more question for Elena, and then one more question for István. Just in terms of time, if we have time at the end, what we'll do is we'll address all the other questions that haven't been asked. So Felix had one, and I'm going to go to this one. Okay. What can we make of the, okay, sorry, let me go to the question you had for Elena. Okay. Oh, wait, Elena, I think you've actually answered the question for him. So I think you guys will be able to see that in the chat. Okay, so let me just see which one, because she addressed it to him in the chat. So let's see. Okay, all right. I think, let's just, I have two questions for you. Okay, but let's just go to these questions anyway. So the two questions he asks are: one, considering the debate surrounding the question of home, especially with regards to how Black and brown bodies experience the world as a result of systemic and structured racial structures. What can we say about these strategies of homemaking of these Black men in Italy? Second, okay, and just summarize it just briefly. The solidarity efforts that Elena draws our attention to, is it also possible to say that they are essentially effective consumptions of the experiences of the other to reify the white subject's notion of humanity and superiority? So you did answer to him privately, but maybe just because it's such a significant question, let's just address it verbally as well. If there's anything you want to add to it.
Okay, yeah. So thank you, Felix. And I do, for the first part of the question, I do believe that most of the solutions for housing or for shelter, or the ones that are controlled by these solidarity actors, they kind of police the identities of the people that sleep there. And so for me, the contrast between what is made available to them and then their own homemaking strategies, which are much more about trying to establish spaces where they feel comfortable enough to express those identities, or have the freedom to move in and out of the space without being monitored. I think that to me, that's what the homemaking strategies are. So it's very difficult for them to be able to do that within the government shelters or within the spaces that are monitored by humanitarian groups or nonprofits in Rome. And then to the second question that I think I answered in the chat, but
just address it.
Yeah, I'll just summarize, but I absolutely agree with that, and I believe a large part of that is the underlying idea that the solidarity actors themselves believe that they should be the ones leading the conversation and kind of guiding people through specific types of participation, and saying, for example, that it's like they give an excuse of language barriers, but personally, I don't by that, but and so yeah, that's what I was hoping by rerouting that fundamental idea to the solidarity efforts through CRT, that they would instead like give the power to the guys themselves to lead those conversations.
Okay, great. And this one, I'm just going to go over to the last one from you, from Philip, who's also involved in this Ubuntu Dialogue project that you'll be hearing about now. So I'm just going to go to this last question. If you could, when you have time during just now, just look at the rest of the questions in the Q&A and see if you can address them. I'll leave them on so you can see them. Apart from the general lack of recognition of an African diaspora in Eastern Europe, this is also the case in places like parts of the Middle East and India, which will also touch on Shobana's presentation. Is it because African descendants do not exist in large numbers in these societies? Or is it because African descendants in these societies are largely integrated into the societies? I ask because in places like the USA and the Caribbean, population of African descendants grew significantly because of efforts at breeding slaves. There's been a long history of excluding these descendants from mainstream society.
Yes, I think this is a very, very interesting question. And you know, what you can see in these 4 countries I have chosen for my narrative today, and especially my country in Hungary, and I showed those figures, out of 10 million people, you can find around 7,000 Africans living in this neglected diaspora of Africans. So it's a very small number, true. At the same time, when you look at the migration history of the country or these countries in East Central Europe, you can see quite homogeneous societies in terms of especially the language and you know, especially the Hungarian language, a very island type of language within, you know, East Central Europe, surrounded by Slavic languages and Germanic languages and your Neo-Latin languages as well. And no connection whatsoever in linguistic terms to all these. So it's a kind of an island, you know, within the Carpathian Basin. So integration is a crucial question. Those Africans living in the country, most of them actually have mixed families and they are well integrated, therefore. But, you know, not just because of their skin color, but because of the very cultural differences, you know, in many cases. Of course, I mean, from society at large, you know, I mean, there is a distance, especially since 2015, when the narrative, you know, driven by the government is very anti-other, you know, anti-otherness in that respect. But you can hear, you know, the government speaking about Hungary should stay as the country or land of the Hungarians only, you know, in the coming years. So it's a very difficult story. And of course, you know, I mean, this is not a big diaspora. And how it has been growing, the tendency is not that fast and not that, you know, large. However, you know, as being integrated and you know, also contributing to local economy, contributing to you know, these foreign policies, you know, we should also deal with, you know, who they are and you know, their background at the same time.
Thank you so much, István.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such a, for your questions. And I've got questions myself, but I'll post them and send them to you at some point. I just wanted to give the participants an opportunity first. What we're going to do now, as I said, before we get to Shobana and Emanuel's presentations, I'm just going to bring up, just give me 2 seconds to find him, Upenu. I'm going to make you a panelist. Will be rejoining as a panelist. Okay. Who is going to tell you about the Ubuntu Dialogues project and about his webinar that'll be next week. Upenu, are you with us as a panelist now? It said that you were added as a panelist. I just can't see you. See? Showing non-video participants. Okay, so I'm going to unmute you. Upenu, can you hear us there?
I can hear you.
Right, fantastic. Listen, we can see your black background, but can you share your slides from your side?
Yes. Did you want me to put my video on as well?
If you would like to, if you want to leave it off, that's also fine. It's up to you.
Okay. Let me share the slides actually.
Okay, great.
Give me a moment here.
Okay, cool. Just go to share screen. Okay, there we go. There we go. Great.
Okay. You can see the screen?
You can see it perfectly, yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Adam, for this opportunity to say a few words regarding the next webinar, which is scheduled for July 9. The webinar is organized under the auspices of the Ubuntu Dialogues project, which is an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funded partnership between the Stellenbosch University Museum and the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. The partnership project seeks to establish new and to strengthen existing connections and cooperation between universities and communities across the Atlantic. It does so by bringing together and by engaging students, academics, professionals, and practitioners in the fields of museum studies, history, and other related fields. The July 9 webinar focuses on understandings and misunderstandings of real and imagined African identities, and with boundaries and belonging, connections and relations among people of African descent in the context of Ghana's 2019 Year of Return campaign. It features African and African American academics and practitioners who will be drawing on their wide and varied African diaspora engagement experiences to reflect on the politics of inclusion and exclusion. The panelists represent a broad range of critical and activist backgrounds, including Blackness, Black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, cultural activism, multilingualism, and journalism. I will come back to the panelists in a moment, but let me take I want to talk a little bit about the other individuals participating in the webinar. The webinar will be chaired by Philip Effiong, who is an associate professor of theater studies at Michigan State University. Philip's research interests revolve around African and African diasporic societies, literatures, and cultures. We are also fortunate to have two distinguished individuals who will be serving as discussants. Shingi Mavima is a graduate of the African American and African Studies Department at Michigan State University and an assistant professor in the History Department at the University of Toledo. Akoso Ampofo is a professor of African and Gender Studies at the University of Ghana, and she is also the president of the African Studies Association of Africa. I also included my image here. I helped put together the panel, but I will be in the background, making sure everything goes well. So I'm coming back here to the panelists. In general, the webinar is an effort to amplify the voices, the perspectives, and the experiences of a wide spectrum of people of African descent. And let me take a moment here to give you an idea of what the four panelists will be reflecting on. Frederick, who studies race in the mainstream media in the US, will address the notion of double consciousness as it pertains to the existential realities of African Americans in the US. Injia, who for 13 years has been involved in organizing the African World Festival in Detroit, Michigan, will discuss the role of the arts in connecting and unifying people of African descent. Harry, who studies Blackness, and he is originally from Kenya. He studies Blackness, Africanness, and multilingualism. He will be presenting the challenges and opportunities for leveraging belonging and unbelonging of the new African diaspora. Bridget, who has served as a reporter, a news anchor, a producer, a presenter on Ghana's TV and media landscape, will examine the possibilities that lie beyond the country's year of return. These themes invite all of us to grapple with why unity has not been realized within the African continent, within several independent African countries, and between Africans and African descendants worldwide. As part of the conversation, the panelists will deliberate on why Ghana is apparently the only country on the African continent that is focusing extensively and proactively on re-establishing ties with the African diaspora. It will also focus on whether there is a possibility of return outside of Ghana, and on whether the return has to be a physical relocation to the continent. We are very, very excited about the opportunity to think together as we explore Pan-African models and approaches that militate against, or those that could strengthen relations between people, between Africans and between African and in the diaspora communities. We hope you can join the July 9 conversation and that you can get word out among those in your networks who you think would also be interested in this subject. Again, thank you, Adam, for the time to talk about the July 9 webinar.
Thank you so much, Upenyu. And thank you for the presentation and for, can you just stop sharing your screen on your sides, just so the next person can share their screen.
Sure. So if I stop share.
Just go stop share. That's great. Yeah. But thank you so much for coming on board, for sharing that with us, and for, well, choosing us as essentially your partner for this event, because I think it feeds very well into everything we've done so far, into this particular webinar as well. I think it's a very nice extension of that. And I think it's going to be a very engaging and exciting conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I think everyone here is as well. Especially looking at your panelists, and as I've said to you, I think it's going to be, I think it's got a lot of potential. I think it's going to be a really great event, so I'm very excited. So thank you so much, Upenyu. So now we're going to move on then, I think, directly to our next session, which will then be chaired by once more, who will do the introductions, and Silindile, who will do the Q&A. I've got that right. Once more, you are doing the introductions. Yes. Yeah, okay, just making sure, yeah.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Felix, for chairing and working on the previous session, and the presenters too. Going forward, I will introduce to you Shobana Shankar, who is based in Stony Brook University State, University of New York, and she'll present to us a presentation is titled Blackness and Anti-Blackness in Asia. I'll not take much time. Shobana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much once more, thank you for your introduction, and to everyone for organizing. I had originally planned to present a paper about how in the era of decolonization, Leopold Senghor of Senegal embarked on a very important project to involve African and Indian students and faculty in a exploration of race and racial origins of Asians and Africans. And his project was focusing on South India and West Africa. But after the murder of George Floyd and others, and recent demonstrations all over the world, I decided to shift back and move back to a larger sort of framework for my presentation that encompasses some of the same questions as the specific paper that I was talking about, but tries maybe overly ambitiously to take on history and the present. So it still deals with some of the same questions about the, as related actually to Philip Effiong's question about Africans and people of African descent in Asia, and trying to relate history to now. The other issue that I want to bring up, in case I can't finish the paper, is the question of African migrants in Asia today. And one of the main themes that I hope to draw out in the paper is that a huge percentage of the migrants, African migrants to Asian countries, particularly China and India, and I'm focusing on India mainly today, contemporarily are students. And so we really do need to think about reframing how migrants, how we talk about the class, intellectual, social locations, cultural locations of migrants, of the global African migration today. So it just made me think from the first papers also that we are talking about a very diverse set of experiences in the African diaspora in the world today. So I'll share my screen with my presentation here. Are you seeing my screen? No. Let me see. Adam, are you? Oh, is everybody seeing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not seeing your screen on my side, Shobana, but we saw it earlier. That was the funny thing.
Yeah.
Is it frozen or something? Is it?
It's not. Let me just make sure it's on slideshow. Do you see it now?
Not yet. What we can do, Felix, and once more, have you got it open? Because maybe if you share her slides from your side, and then Shobana, you'll just have to go next slide, please. Next slide. Please.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's fine. Yeah. Felix, so once more, can you open it from your sides? I can try opening it from my side, but my computer might freeze. It's strange that it's not sharing though, because we tried it.
Yeah.
Felix, can you?
If not, I can.
I'm looking for it.
Okay. Yeah, Felix is looking for it. Okay. If you can't find it, I'll try share mine. Do you want to start in the meantime?
Yeah,
I will. We'll check.
Can you see it now?
No.
Okay. There must be some problem, even though we tested this. But okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So I want to start actually with some contemporary background to consider that. Even a month before, or almost a month before George Floyd's murder and the ensuing demonstrations against racial injustice in America, the pandemics, the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and racism and racial abuse were emerging in China. Human Rights Watch reported that Africans in China, particularly in Guangzhou, in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong, where there is the largest population of Africans in China, Human Rights Watch had documented racist abuse of Africans using public health rationale. So African informants reported that although all foreigners the province had required that all foreigners were to accept COVID-19 prevention and containment measures, this seemed to be being applied to Africans in a more directed and targeted and harsher way. So some of the measures included forced testing and quarantine, forcing African immigrants to self-quarantine and isolate and being surveilled with cameras. And then after this, social discrimination ensued, such as Africans being turned away from being served in hospitals, in restaurants. This was not the beginning of anti-Black racism in this part of China, but it was a new ugly turn. And the Human Rights Watch report also highlighted that the Chinese government knew at this time that the main reason for the rapid spread of COVID was actually Chinese nationals who were returning from different parts of the country, and nonetheless Africans were being targeted. The Kenyan government, the African governments responded. Thank you. So this would be slide 2, Felix. Thank you that I'm on. So African governments responded to requests from their citizens to support them. The Kenyan government announced that it would fly Kenyans back home. Many nations co-signed an open letter to the African Union demanding investigations. Nigeria, Uganda, Ghana, and other countries summoned Chinese ambassadors who were resident in their own countries to make high-level protestations against the treatment of Africans. But of course, these abuses were happening against the backdrop of major Chinese investment in African countries, the Belt and Road Initiative. And so African citizens who were suffering abuse really felt like they were, in many cases, being abandoned by their government to economic interests. Now, recently, American media have also reported that this has come full circle in that now African Americans are facing more restrictions. African Americans residing in China are facing more restrictions, particularly since the Black Lives Matter demonstrations have started also, which I want to highlight as a sort of theme throughout my paper is that the association of Blackness with political positions, political ideology, and political protest in countries that have high rates of censorship of media, as well as dissent, is another fear in this era that we must face, that protests against racism around the world may actually create backlash against African migrants in different countries where politics and dissent have been attempted to be suppressed.
This is a problem.
I just also want to move on to setting some context in India, where the estimate is that there are 60,000 Africans living in India, which is a tiny minority in a huge country, but of course is also a large number of immigrants compared to the sorts of statistics that István just showed. And there has been racist attacks against Africans in cities like Delhi in 2014 and other parts of the country. And since the Black Lives Matter protests have started and the murders of African Americans in the United States coming to light at the hands of police, there has been expressed support from South Asians in the United States joining these protests. But in India and in other parts of the world, there have also been soul searching and feelings of returning to to put it bluntly, an uncomfortable history between Africans and Indians that goes back to the history of colonialism or even the pre-colonial era in the Indian Ocean world. In India, the progressives, leftists in particular, have accused celebrities and other people, other Indians, of jumping on hashtag humanitarianism, tagging Black Lives Matter on their phones, but not protesting discrimination against African immigrants in India, or discrimination against Muslims in India that's reached new levels, as well as Christians in India now, and ethnic minorities. So there's been a revival of festering wounds for India in particular, and in India's incomplete democracy, I would say, or a halting project of democracy for a country that likes to pride itself as, the largest democracy in the world. So one of the slides that I had wanted to show was actually about protests that have targeted Gandhi, Black Lives Matter protests that have targeted Gandhi statues. As many people know, there have been protests centered around Gandhi statues around the African continent for several years now. And there was, in the United States, Gandhi statue defaced in Washington, D.C., and in England, there was one Gandhi statue that in Leicester City where there was graffiti painted on the statue, but also that there was a petition with thousands of signatures to actually remove the statue. And what I had on my slide too to show was that now Indian immigrants, or maybe many generations, British Indians, surrounding the statue to protect it, and the Gandhi statue along with the Nelson Mandela statue and Churchill statue in Parliament Square have been protected by the British police and been boarded up and taken and I think maybe moved or at least boarded up. And what's interesting about that is these are three men that celebrate the empire and decolonization as a friendly, liberal, progressive kind of project, or one that at least Britain could feel better about itself, that that Gandhi and Church and Mandela could be included with Churchill, that the empire was faulty but also inclusive. And so I think, you know, one of my main goals is also to sort of contextualize the Gandhi protest. Why would Gandhi be a center of protest? You know, there's often a kind of parallelism or connection actually made between Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. But I think one of we haven't unpacked enough yet why African and African diasporic peoples would reject Gandhi's legacy. And one of the major contentions, I would argue, is the question about nonviolent resistance. For Black people all over the world, nonviolent resistance hasn't always worked. And there has been protests against Gandhi within India as well. Muslim minorities have protested Gandhi statues. Maoist dissidents have also protested Gandhi statues and Gandhi's legacy, and also the so-called untouchables or Dalit activists. And in fact, when the Gandhi protest started, the Gandhi statue protest started in Ghana, African scholars, Ghanaian scholars, were saying, you know, why we would like a statue of Ambedkar, who's considered the founder of untouchable or Dalit politics, or, you know, resistance against oppression. So I think one of my main arguments is there's a sophisticated, important ideological nexus between Asian and African, particularly African and Indian politics and racial politics. So to give some of my larger points at the beginning, and I'll return to a couple of cases if I can, and also maybe I'll just share my PowerPoint with everybody. I have several patterns and conclusions that I want to give, and you know, before I go into any specifics. And the first is that Africa-Asia race relations is a global history of race. A lot of people have questioned, you know, I've presented my research in different forums, and people say, well, is talking about race in an African-Asian context appropriate? Is race oh, can everybody see this now? The slides? Let's see. We should be on slide 4 if you could advance. Oh, thank you. Oh, actually, can you, sorry, Felix, could you just go up to 3, please, so I can show the Gandhi statue? Yeah, this just shows how Gandhi was being boarded up in Parliament Square. Thank you so much for getting, because these are great, some of these slides. And you can see in the bottom picture, well, you can see on the right side that we want justice painted on the Gandhi statue in Leicester City. And then you can see at the bottom to the left, these South Asian British community members surrounding the Gandhi statue, showing that they feel very, you know, this is a great affront to attack Gandhi. But as I've said, there are actually legitimate ideological positions from which one could attack Gandhi. Attack meaning, you know, disagree with Gandhi. And also the mantle of nonviolence, does it only rest with Gandhi? So here is my slide about sort of my larger points. Race is a productive concept through which to explore global history and particularly African-Asian relations. People have asked me, are you imposing an American or Atlantic category on Asian and African history to talk about race? The word might not be the perfect word. but it does have a lot of important, in focusing on race, we can talk a lot about productive, important social, cultural, political, economic differences, as well as attempts at solidarity around the question of race and African-Asian relations. And I made reference, for example, to Senghor's project to actually explicitly look at race in post-colonial education for Africans and Indians. The second point is that African-Asian reckoning with race is about post-coloniality. Often in the West, the discussion of empire recedes, particularly in America. Of course, America is an empire in and of itself, and also connected to other empires, British Empire, French Empire. But I would argue empires with control over labor, migration, and nation formation incubated racial hierarchies. Between African diaspora and Asian diaspora, we're talking about the largest diasporas in the world. And so how Africans and Asians have moved around the world and interacted with each other is a global story about empires and post-imperial racial formations. The third point, African-Asian solidarity, Afro-Asian solidarity. I think we can make a comparison to the civil rights movement to say that there were some advances that came out of Afro-Asian solidarity, but also a skimming over or papering over some very real conflicts. So, for example, have Asian countries or peoples, I have a question here about China and India's relationship to Ethiopia, China to Tanzania, influences have gone that direction. How do we know how much Africans have influenced Asian peoples, Asian ideologies, Asian countries, Asian nationalisms? So I think that this solidarity is often used, and it is a rhetorical device, but how deep that solidarity goes and what it obscures is a subject that we need to really delve into, which is what my research does. And the final point that I want to make is the struggle against anti-Blackness, and this is related to all the other points that I've made, is really also about changing how we recount history. And this is where I come back to Gandhi, Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr. They are considered worthy of global recognition. They have entered world history, but other leaders have not, and have not been allowed that place. And why not? And I think we can go back to thinking about why a Gandhi statue or why a Mandela statue may be defaced, because there is a real craving for a critical history, and critical history to be taught to more children and to more students and to more adults, that these struggles were far from complete, but also left out a lot of people, or at least their contributions have not been necessarily acknowledged in history. So if you could advance my slide, thank you. Those are my general points. So I just also want to point out that, so I want to start by defining Blackness in South Asia. I think I'm running out of time too, but that's the next slide. This is just a picture to show you that there was a connection between Dalit politics, so-called untouchable politics, and African diaspora politics in this brief encounter we've seen, correspondence between Ambedkar, who studied at Columbia University in the early 1900s, and W.E.B. Du Bois. But let me move on to, this gets to, I think, also Philip F. Young's question and some of the topics we were talking about before. Now I'm going to focus on South Asia, not Asia broadly writ. There has been, of course, migration of Africans to South Asia for longer than there's been migration to the Atlantic world. Double the time, if we could say, or even more. At least from 800, Africans as enslaved peoples went through the Indian Ocean, Red Sea, and Mediterranean. Historians estimate 12.5 million Africans went, 12.58 million as slaves, but this is an estimate. We have no idea, really, because the slave trade went on for so long, and there were so many ways in which people migrated in those routes. Now, so slaves were used differently in the Asian and particularly Islamic context. As soldier in India, African slaves were soldiers, domestic servants, and concubines. Some Africans became generals and chiefs, so rose to very high prominence. And their descendants are called today in India and Pakistan. India, Sidis or Habshi from the word for Ethiopia, Habasha, and Shidis or Makrani in Pakistan. One general point I want to make also is that in India and Pakistan, Africans have a very important, and Blackness have very important religious importance. This is something that often gets left out of Western ideologies of race, other than to talk about Christianity or Islam as a point of protest. But the actual skin color and Blackness has spiritual significance. In Hinduism, the black god Krishna and the goddess Kali. Kali, of course, that term becomes used, Kala, black, as a pejorative, but Kali is a very powerful goddess. In Islam, with Bilal, the caller to prayer, being an Ethiopian, of course, also embedded into many Islamic ideologies of baraka or blessedness of Black people as descendants of Bilal. And in India and Pakistan, specific Africans have been anointed as saints. If you could advance a slide, thank you. This could be the end of my talk. I know I'm running out of time, but
yes,
this is, sorry?
Yeah, I'm saying yes, please, you should complete now.
Okay, so I'll use this as my last slide, or maybe I'll just go to the conclusion after this. But this is a fascinating example of a point I think that Philip F. Young also made, which is how embedded people of African descent are in South Asia, to the point, integration is a difficult word to use. And assimilated is also difficult because they have these sometimes negative or positive connotations. This is just a very complicated way in which Africans have been absorbed into South Asian society. This example is from Pakistan, from the Makrani in the Sindh region of Pakistan, who today are the Shidis or Makrani, are the keepers of the shrine of an Islamic saint, Pir Mungo, who is said to have come from Iraq in the 13th century. The fascinating issue is that people who came as slaves after the end of slavery in 1843, that abolished by the British, were absorbed as ritual experts, as apart from the caste system. They were above the so-called untouchables, but they were keepers of the shrine where, as you can see in the bottom picture from today, from present times, the shrine keepers keep a festival or lead a festival in which they feed crocodiles who are said to have the saint spirits in them. And you can see on the bottom right side a girl of the Shidi ethnic group at the festival. So one of the issues that I'll conclude with is that Black identity is in formation in Asia and in South Asia. And I think we will see layers of that identity are very deep. They have ritual importance, but now, if you could go to my very last slide, I'll conclude. But now we have new elaborations with tens of thousands of Africans migrating to South Asia and to India, Pakistan. And so how we contend with what Blackness means in Asia is a very difficult question, and anti-Blackness. But as you can see, my third point, it's bodily, gendered, economic, and political dimensions. Solidarity doesn't cover all of it. There are these, solidarity is a very secular sort of word. There are religious and other forms of moral economy operating. And the final point that I want to highlight is that Black Lives Matter is a grassroots and anti-violent movement with revolutionary potential to it has swept the entire globe. Will people of African descent in Asian countries feel emboldened by it? And also, does it have to pay respect to Gandhian nonviolence? Can Black Lives Matter become a slogan without reference to other, you know, paying homage to Gandhi. I think that's, you know, I'll leave it there. And finally, also the point about African students, that we need to really contend with the idea that there are knowledge diasporas around the world today who cannot be absorbed. Their experiences should not be necessarily absorbed into one narrative of migration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shobana. That was one interesting presentation. People post questions as we continue to the next presentation, which I haven't seen yet. I assume they're still coming. And Slindy obviously will then conduct that session. For the next presentation, I'll introduce Emanuel Chima, who is a doctoral student in the School of Social Work at Michigan State University. And his presentation will be focusing on refugee youth identity formation at Dzaleka refugee camp in Dowa district, Malawi. As I did initially with you, Shobana, I will not take time. Emanuel, you can go on already.
All right, thank you. So I conceptualized my study when I came to learn that some youth at the Dzaleka refugee camp had been resident there since the Rwandan genocide in '94. That's some 26 years ago. And so I became fascinated with the idea of how they had come to form their identities in this protracted refugee situation. I'm going to share my screen here and take you through my slides. Okay, and so, you know, in light of the current global refugee crisis, many youth go through their socialization and identity development within protracted crises or contexts outside of their places of origin. And as refugee youth traverse these socially constructed spaces, their inherent need for grounding intensifies. Such stability is particularly paramount during the variable period of adolescence, which impacts their identity formation. Now, identity development is the culmination of complex processes by which people develop a sense and understanding of themselves within the context of social norms and cultural context. Identity formation is nebulous for displaced populations in particular, as they contend with both the cultural norms of their places of origin and their new settings of liminality. Now, the nature of liminality hinders the realization of potential among refugee youth and also affects their continuing perception of self. So in 1987, Malawi began taking policy action to address issues of refugee protection and integration in Malawian society. To that end, Malawi became party to the Organization of African Unity, now African Union, Refugee Convention of 1969, the United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951 and its accompanying protocol created in 1967, and the Convention relating to the status of stateless persons of 1954, but not the related Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness of 1961. Okay, right. I'm just gonna go back here, sorry, a little bit to highlight Malawi's refugee policy some more. And so the Malawian Refugee Act of 1989 came with international agreements and enforceable restrictions at the local level. Now, while policymakers attempted to bring civil order to their nation, refugees themselves struggled with the new, more restrictive refugee policy. Implicit to the policy was the intention for the Mozambican refugees to eventually be repatriated back after the civil war, something which the policy's restrictive nature was meant to ensure. This was reflected in the limitations placed on personal freedoms for refugees, which included the rights to access pathways to citizenship, various social resources, educational opportunities, freedom to assemble, equal employment, mobility, and place of residence. Now, these limitations have remained in place to the present day, such that refugees from other countries remain unable to access basic rights to incorporation in Malawi. Now, refugee youth in particular, defined in my study as anyone from the age of 18 to 24, borrowing this definition from the US Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs. These youth experience personal developmental challenges emanating from the restrictions. So refugee youth who cannot gain employment, attend traditional schools or tertiary institutions, or participate in Malawian civic life must spend their formative years waiting for their placement in the limited opportunities available in the refugee camps or better prospects after refugee resettlement. And now this slide here captures the demographics of the sample that I will talk about in the findings from my study. Now just to say a little bit about the Dzaleka refugee camp, as I alluded to earlier, it was established in 1994 following the Rwandan genocide, and it currently has over 38,000 residents. In order to keep its operations afloat, Malawi collaborates with UNHCR and its partner organizations. Refugees at the camp are predominantly from Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Rwanda. And there are also minority communities from Somalia, Ethiopia, and a few other countries. Now, a JAM report from 2014 reported that the majority population of the camp sought refuge from war and active conflict in the African Great Lakes region and are long staying. And so with Dzaleka being a de facto protracted refugee situation, residents live in a community akin to a big village. And now I want to focus on the core part of my study, which is the identity formation. So the major finding was that the key institution that participants referred to when evaluating or explaining the nature of their being was education. This was not surprising, as many of the youth do not have any formal pathways to other forms of social structures, such as legal employment, access to the formal market economy, and the option of naturalization. Long-staying youth at the camp essentially experienced entire academic careers within the confines of the camp, which is both schools and tertiary institutions. Now, the primary and secondary school education in the camp is provided by the nonprofit Jesuit Refugee Service and follows the national curriculum. In a similar manner, university education is delivered by Jesuit Worldwide Learning, a separate nonprofit also affiliated with the Society of Jesus, which is a Catholic order of priests more widely known as the Jesuits. The organization is a community learning center in the camp that offers undergraduate programs in partnership with global university partners through online instruction and some on-site programming. So in my study of interest was how participants filtered their education filtered their identity formation vis-a-vis concepts of education. My codebook revealed that the manner in which refugee youth understood and made meaning of their education was a function of their identity formation, which resulted in two categories: liminal identity and aspirational identity. Now, the codes for data analysis were at the first level, education, and at the second level, 5 descriptions of education and associated processes. These were schooling, future goals, motivation, instructive life experiences, higher education opportunities, and refugee resettlement. In terms of liminal identity, from the study data, liminal identity was identified liminal identity was identified from the second level codes of schooling, instructive life experiences, and motivation. Parallel to the day-to-day attendance of school as pupils, participants in the study also had meaningful experiences from which they received valuable instruction. Together, these experiences fueled the participants' motivation for pursuing higher education in particular. A liminal experience for the youth in the camp resulted from life between a former homestead and the expectation of eventual return to a life of normalcy, stability, and security. The protraction of such liminality has hence superimposed alternative identity on the youth. Within the liminal space, schooling occupied time and provided stability for the youth. In Malawi, as at the Dzaleka refugee camp, this entailed a 12-year primary and secondary school cycle from ages 6 to 17. Participants in the study were mostly secondary school graduates or close to the completion of their studies. This allowed for a retrospective inquiry of the participants' schooling and its impact on their refugee experience. Now, to say a little bit about aspirational identity, the youth's aspirational identity was identified from the second level codes of future goals, higher education opportunities, and refugee resettlement. Completion of secondary school then became a symbolic marker of anticipated progression to the more they hoped to accomplish. During the youth's protracted stay in the camp, schooling provided a social tether and also resulted in the academic foundation from which the youth's aspirations sprung. Aspirational identity delivered temporary escape from the reality of life in the camp and the rights denied to the youth in Malawi. Now, to conclude, a prolonged refugee experience undermines the extent to which youth undergo normative identity development. Refugee youth therefore have to find alternative channels for constructing identity. UNHCR 2017 reported that education buffers the psychosocial hardship that displacement creates for youth. Participants in the study were able to mediate the uncertainty and limitation of their circumstance through the medium of the school, as well as their post-secondary aspirations. By dreaming, participants exhibited a balancing of external challenges with their will not only to survive, but also to thrive. In support, Bromley 1988 affirmed, the ability to withstand stress and to resolve life problems gains strength from the integrity of one's sense of identity. Now, limitations to the study and characteristics of participants comprise gender roles, a variation in length of stay at the camp, and the inclusion criteria of age, which excluded youth actively attending secondary school. Nevertheless, youth in the refugee camps need targeted interventions to address the effects of their developmental experiences within the context of camp life. Now, this could include guidance counseling and education advising, which can help refugee youth successfully navigate the limited post-secondary resources and opportunities available to them. Consequently, refugee youth can be shielded from experiencing what Bromley calls a failed mission syndrome, which can further add to their trauma. And this is paramount because a healthy identity formation process informs the degree to which refugee youth become fully functioning members of society and better self-actualized individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuel. Yeah, so I hand over to Slindile to now facilitate the question and answer session.
Thanks once more, and thank you to the presenters. I'm not sure if you can all see me. I don't seem to see myself, but that's fine. Yeah, thank you to Emanuel and Shobana for your very insightful presentations. As with the first session, I don't know if you both would like to ask each other questions or there are any linkages to your research that you'd like to comment on.
I found an interesting parallel, Emanuel. I don't know if you feel this too, but in some ways we both addressed kind of this almost disappearance of identity for people migrating. Mine was like disappeared identity over a long period, where your paper also suggests certain conditions, the material conditions or education can or lack thereof opportunities can diminish identity formation. So I thought that was very interesting that even though we're talking about very different cases, that we have a common problem in the cases. And it made me also think of, these newer countries, post-colonial nations grappling with problems of minority or displaced people's identity formation. And if there is a post-colonial problem that these countries have in recognizing the diversity of their peoples.
Right, I agree with that. Listening to your presentation, what I found most insightful was how you drew attention to the Eurocentric lens with which we often look at issues of race with. When I started looking at the population of youth at the Dzaleka refugee camp, the lens with which I went into that situation was a national identity lens, because I was asking myself, these youth have been here since 94 or later, and some of them are so far removed from, you know, their places of national origin. Do they then identify with Malawi or these other countries? And even in that, I had a Eurocentric lens because, you know, nation states as we know them in Africa today were divided by, you know, the colonial experience. And so as I did my interviews, I discovered that what the youth were sharing is that their grounding didn't necessarily come from their national origin, which they were aware of, but rather in that liminal space of, you know, growing up in a refugee camp, their education was more central because this is the thing that occupied their time, you know, from a very young age. And then thereafter, when they exited the school system, they were then in limbo again, which just accentuated the liminal space. And so I agree with you, Shobana, that there is indeed a coloration between our papers.
And also just to add, you know, what is the content of their education? Because of their, you know, are we still using, you know, textbooks from Britain or the US? That then what kind of relevance does that have for the contexts of these places? I mean, it's just, you know, what history is being told, or what cultural studies or language studies, you know, does English become the default because there's so many languages spoken in a refugee camp? Right.
Yeah, in the Malawian context, the school curriculum builds on, you know, the legacy of British colonialism. And so, you know, in my experience, whilst in school, we read Shakespeare, Dickens, and, you know, that was what was considered the canon. It wasn't until I got to university as an undergrad and read English that I was exposed to African writers, and the first novel that I read being Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you know, and so it opened up a whole different world, because up until that point, my understanding of what being cultured meant was essentially having this elitist English perspective, which is very exclusive, and which is impossible to aspire to for, you know, people in post-colonial spaces, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you both. I think for now, I will open up the session to the attendees to ask the questions. I see we already have a few questions. First, I'll read a comment from Philip. He's saying, Shobana, I teach the Indian Ocean slave trade and the CD community in one of my classes. I hope I can get a copy of your PowerPoint slide. He put his email address, so I think you guys will get in touch with each other. And then also from Philip as well, there's a question for you, Shobana. It says, considering the fact that several Indians are significantly dark, do these Indians also face discrimination? If yes, are these differences in the prejudices these Indians face versus, if yes, are there differences in the prejudices these Indians face versus the prejudices African descendants face?
This is a really great question. One of the points in my paper, you know, what Indians, if, you know, will say about race now is, yes, there is a preference for lightness, and we do discriminate against people who are darker in our own country. But then they'll say the reason for that is because of the legacy of colonialism. We were sort of taught that by British privilege. Now, I think actually, looking at the history, Aryan and Dravidian, this was a division of Aryan, these were linguistic divisions or differences, that the Northern Indian languages are classified with Aryan, Indo-European languages, and Dravidian languages, the South Indian languages, were classified with a different group. Similar to linguistic classifications in African languages. And in fact, there's a very similar pattern that they became associated with race. So Hamitic, if people are familiar with that term, becomes associated with, you know, Fulbe color or Fulbe ethnicity, or Amharic, or in Tutsi. This is another relationship between our papers, is that, so colonial ideology might not have introduced the difference between Aryan and Dravidian, but it introduced a hierarchical scheme of social Darwinian thought that one group was better than the other, that language categories became racialized, so our differences became racialized. So I think there is a preference for for lighter skin. And some of it goes back to maybe deep history, although again, because there's an ambivalence associated, there's power and spiritual importance with dark skin. I mean, Krishna or Kali are very important. Gods and goddesses. So I think there is an internal or a real self-questioning and loathing about skin color. I mean, to be frank. And this is why you see skin lightening creams and that sort of thing if you go to India and posters. So people of darker skin do face discrimination. I think that Philip's question, is it the same? There are similarities. And in fact, one minister of parliament from North India said, we're not racist against Africans because we treat South Indians as part of our own community and they're darker than us. So this is exactly the sort of question that Senghor actually wanted to study, which is fascinating. So I don't want to take up all the time, but I think there's a lot more to unpack about how skin color within societies of color shapes different social experiences. And now it's not to say that darker skinned people have not risen to power in India. They have, and people of African descent also in some spaces. But which spaces those are, it still doesn't command the amount of power necessarily that lighter skinned people might command.
Cool, thanks, Shobana. I think we have a comment here for Emanuel from Tandega. Okay, my thing, sorry, let me just go to it. Seems to have disappeared.
Oh, it's in the answered part.
Pardon?
You click on the answered section of the Q&A.
Oh, you've answered it. Okay. Have you answered it? Cool. All right. No, I thought maybe you'd wanted to comment on that.
Sure, I could speak to it. So Tandeka highlighted here that my study speaks closely to her own study on teacher identity and role in the face of immigration and education in South Africa. The historical context is very important in exploring the phenomenon of identity. Yeah, I think there's definitely some parallels there as I read that. If you look at the population in Dzaleka, the youth, the conflicts that have been going on in that region that are historical in nature explain their displacement. And so there's that parallel there. And in my own study, I drew lens from a study that talked about the school, nurturing identity. And so here I see her talking about, in her study, teacher identity and role. And so, since in my study, I highlighted that education was sort of the foundation on which these youth built their identity, it goes to say that the teachers had a role to play in that as well, because they're the ones that imparted the content that the students got to engage with. And so those would be some of the thoughts that I have for Tandeka.
Cool, thanks, Emanuel. Another question for you, Shobana, from Jamie. It says, another question related to both presentations, I guess it's to both presentations, are the themes of liminality and aspiration and identity formation. Since you emphasize that most Africans in Asia are students, would themes of liminal and aspirational identity be useful in your study as well?
Thank you. And this actually relates to Emanuel's point that he just made. I mean, I do think a lot of the Africans who have migrated recently to India, for one example, but also I think China, a lot of them are students and they're young. And so what does that mean? I mean, I think in countries, for example, like in India, where right now there's a lot of backlash from the government and the police against student protests, dissent, it means that their identity may be they have to keep themselves sort of they're policing themselves, self-censoring themselves in the context of aspiration. Also, I think it's also very significant that to go back to the learning, as in Emanuel's paper, I mean, what these students are coming to study, I think, is worth exploring, a more systematic exploration of why, what do they want out of their studies to go to Asian countries and come, and work and maybe migrate. I mean, you know, we know that a lot of students end up settling, but is that possible for students in China or possible for African students in India? It doesn't seem so given the context, and that could even be part of the intent of racism. I think there's a lot of also, just final point, there's a lot of gender dimensions to this. One of the slides I showed a picture of Indian men surrounding young African men shopping in a mall in 2014 in Delhi. And there's a kind of masculinist competition also, or this feeling of being threatened by young, aspiring classes of young people. So I think there are a lot of components to unpack, and I do think, you know, liminality as young people, as young mobile people, and who are also a part of an economy, that the knowledge economy, and I'm still trying to work out what that means, but this is one of the most important factors, I think, in the Global South. Is there's the great quest and a lot of possibility associated with education seeking, knowledge seeking, book publishing, technology. I mean, these are older, the book is an older theme, but I think there is a history there about knowledge sharing among countries outside of the West, where even the content of what's in those is about to learn to see the world from a different side than what people have gotten, which is the Western side.
Oh, and then another question for you, Shobana, as well. There's no name, just I think it's a staff number, but it says, Shobana, how many of these Black minorities in India have reached prominent positions, either at regional or national levels, or do they just remain relics of their past in Indian society?
I think this is a very good and important question. I mean, I think there have been, one of the areas where you have seen a global attention is to the CD or Makrani music. And so why is music a sphere that racial difference may be celebrated, but not in political power, right? And this is actually a common theme between the United States and India. So CD music can be exported as this, you know, prominent feature of Indian society. It's multicultural, multiracial history and music and religion and dance, but cultural, you know, cultural products, but not political power. I think it deserves more unpacking, but this is where I see the most prominent place for Afro-Indians. And those are also people from the North. Generally, there are also, Pashington Obeng has talked about CDs in South India who are poor and have no attention. So I think it's, and you know, not to get into this, but India has had a very complicated system of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and access to education. So there have been different policies to try to address this.
Oh, before we move on to a question for Emanuel, there's a comment again from Thandeka Sivia, director to Shobana, which says, thank you for your in-depth analysis. Look at prostitution as well, forced and voluntary among Africans in India. So I guess maybe you guys can touch base with each other after this. And then,
sorry.
Yes?
I think let's just take one more question from Emanuel, and then we can just start wrapping up. Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is the last, okay, there were two more questions, but I think we'll take this one. Emanuel from Philip, it says, would you agree that when relocation is a choice, identity isn't really an issue, being that the individual chooses to assume new identities? Within refugees, new identities are not necessarily a choice. Would you say this factor creates unique identity problems?
Yes, I agree with both of those notions, and I would like to illustrate that with examples from the Dzaleka context. So regarding the idea of relocation as choice, there's a minority population of Ethiopians in the camp at Dzaleka, and unlike the other residents who are refugees in the literal sense, the Ethiopian community tends to be economic migrants that are intercepted on their way to South Africa or stop on their way there. And so in that instance, they're economic migrants. And so issues of identity don't arise within that group in the same way that they would with, say, the Rwandan group, the Burundian group, the Congolese group, the Somali group that are fleeing conflict. And looking at the youth as a specific subset, I looked at how these youth who had grown up in the camp were identifying, because essentially this is the home they've known for many years, but because they're restricted to this geographical space of the refugee camp, they were also closely in touch with the cultural heritage that has been preserved, which in some sense is removed from what that culture is like in their places of origin. And so that also presents challenges when they come into contact with new arriving refugees who might carry with them aspects of their culture that they are not familiar with. And so I agree with you that certainly unique identity problems do arise for individuals that are forcibly displaced, unlike those who choose to relocate themselves freely.
Sure. Unfortunately, we only had time for one question. I think these conversations go on, and I think this is an opportunity for people to network as well as take these conversations beyond the webinar and follow up with whatever comments or I don't know, questions that they might have had. Thank you to Shobana and Emanuel for closing or for wrapping up the session, and to those who asked questions and participated. It was a really insightful session. I think that's all from me. I'll hand over to Adam in case you have any last minute remarks.
No, I just want to say thank you to all of you for wonderful presentations. Unfortunately, I had a moment where I had to go in and out. I became an attendee. So I didn't. I missed some wonderful moments, which I really want to. I will definitely go back to the recording and check out. But thank you just to all of you for your wonderful papers. And I just love the way they resonated with one another thematically and how they all came together so beautifully. I think this has been a great panel. As you see, there's so many questions here. I'm gonna leave this on for 10 minutes. So if you want to address those questions, write those responses now. The attendees can stay and you can answer them if you would like to write those responses. So I'll say, let's leave 5-10 minutes. I'll let you guys just write any responses that you would like to. Other than that, I just want to say thank you to all of you for attending today. And our next webinar, as you heard, will be on 9th of July. And on that focus of that webinar, we had Upenyo come and talk about the Ubuntu Dialogues project and the idea of looking at different diasporic communities and the way they network with one another, connections and issues of identity and belonging, all of which I think feed very well into this particular panel. And I think it makes a great complement panel. So absolutely. So thank you very much all for joining us this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much. And thank you all for your stimulating presentations, as Felix says. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.